Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by nailib.com. We are looking at History SL, wherein we are dealing with paper 1, and amongst the prescribed subject we have chosen the move to global war. In that we are looking at the Japanese expansion, and under that we are now going to in this video discuss two important topics. One is the change to a new era called the Shōwa Era, and second is the role of China in the expansion of Japan and the kind of foreign expansion that Japan has, keeping in mind the Chinese state. So while this might sound counterintuitive, that why are we talking about or why are we discussing China as a part of the Japanese expansion, but do remember that as far as military expansions are concerned, you always need the other to expand against. You always need an enemy, real or imagined. That's a separate case study and a separate story altogether. But it's very important to think that there is an enemy which is required in this case, and in this case for Japan the enemy is China. So let's first start and talk about the Shōwa era. On the death of his father, Emperor Taisho, in 1926, and having served as regent for the previous 4 years, it is the Crown Prince Hirohito who ascended the imperial throne and became Emperor Shōwa, and it's Hirohito who will take Japan and who will be the Emperor of Japan during the Second World War. He becomes a very important international figure as well as we talk about the Second World War between 1939 and 1945. So it is Hirohito under his emperorship that particular war takes place. So Crown Prince Hirohito becomes Emperor Shōwa. The new emperor was a young man who had rarely left Japan, with one exception being in 1921. And even then, he was warned beforehand about the poison of European liberal thought. So you can see the kind of upbringing that he has had. European thought is very, very clearly, liberal thought, especially in Europe, is very, very clearly seen as being poisonous. So you already of course remember from the previous videos the devil's ships that were brought by Commodore Perry. So the Western world seen as bringers of the devil's ships, and now the European thought is seen as poisonous. He had then been sent on a tour to Europe. That just keep in mind that you're going to see poisonous things. With that kind of a clear instruction, he was sent to Europe. According to Buruma, educated to believe absolutely in the myths of Japanese racial purity and the divine provenance of his own bloodlines as though they were historical facts. So that is how he was brought up. That is how he was trained to believe completely that his family belonged to the family of the sun goddess on the one hand, and absolutely divine provenance of his own decisions. So the fact that the emperor can do no wrong, that was his upbringing from the childhood. And imagine this kind of a person becoming ruler of a country in the 1920s, especially a country that's dreaming and hoping of militaristic expansion. So this kind of clarity of thought that I am divine and so is my family will of course have very, very different kind of impact for Japan and its military ambitions. The young Crown Prince Hirohito was apparently impressed by the informality of British aristocratic manners, even at Buckingham Palace, that contrasted with the elaborate and strictly enforced code of behavior in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. So this is something that he is known to have recorded, that the Buckingham Palace, which is the British aristocracy, they seemed more informal vis-a-vis what he was seeing in Japan. So one can understand the kind of formality and protocol that must have been followed in Japan, if at all we need to understand. If in comparison the British seem to be more informal, then you need to start thinking of what your definition of formality is. If Hirohito had wanted to introduce some informality, however, he would have been rapidly disabused of any such idea in a culture that had been built upon the veneration of the emperor. There was no scope for any kind of informal thought as far as Hirohito is concerned. In accordance with the Shinto rituals, the coronation that took place on 14th November 1926 took place after Hirohito had spent the night at Ise, the holiest of Shinto temples, communing with his ancestor, the sun goddess. The following morning, reborn as a living god, Hirohito could assume his role as emperor to take Japan from Taisho era into Shōwa era, meaning a time of illustrious peace. So it's during the time of illustrious peace that the Second World War breaks out in Japan. So that's so much for fancy naming of eras. But the Shōwa era simply means the time of illustrious peace. That needs to be remembered and might be useful for your source-based answers. Having read through this section, you can see how Japan emerged out of World War I as a modern and ambitious country, growing in prosperity and moving towards a more democratic system of government as it entered the Shōwa era. So, in the beginning of the Shōwa era, there seems to be this kind of a nascent, a beginner's understanding of democracy. Even so, there was a lingering disaffection with the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles as well as the naval treaties. You remember that Japan was again and again made smaller than both Britain and US in terms of the naval treaties. So there is a lot of anger against those treaties. Many of its citizens felt that Japan was being denied its rightful place as an equal of the Western powers. Within the Japanese military, which owed allegiance only to the emperor, there were groups of militant nationalists who were now wanting to purify Japan. And it is this kind of purificatory aspect that starts pushing forward a new kind of extremist militarism. And that is something that we need to keep an eye out for. One such organization was the Sakurakai, or the Cherry Blossom Society, established in 1930. Opposed to political corruption and disarmament policies, its intention was to set up military government and to rid Japan of corrupt politicians. So this kind of extreme militaristic thought is now entering the political system of Japan. The idea that the politicians are corrupt and that the only pure organization in the country is in fact the military, and everybody should in fact focus on the rise and the importance of the military. And the only way to do that is to get the military in politics and get rid of all the other corrupt political ministers. According to a society pamphlet produced by the Sakurakai, the poisonous sword of the thoroughly degenerate politicians is being pointed at the military. So the sword consists of politicians. You can utilize this as a source reading as well. Remember that this paper is a source-based paper. So the idea that politicians are a sword which is poisonous, this is the kind of metaphor being used in this source. This was clearly demonstrated in the London treaties. So historical allegation, the fact that these corrupt politicians have ended up giving up the kind of superiority that Japan had. It is obvious that the party politicians' sword that was used against the navy will soon be used to reduce the size of the army. So the navy, they have already lost to both UK and the US, and very soon they are going to lose us in the army as well. This is a pamphlet that has been produced by a group that's thinking of introducing militarist ideas into the politics of Japan. Hence, we must arouse ourselves and wash out the bowels of the completely decadent politicians. So basically, once again, an entire era of murders is being encouraged from this military perspective. Now, within all of this, of course, the enemy that gets created as far as the Japanese are concerned, and this kind of military perversion, you can say, or this kind of military build-up, you can say, it does require an enemy, and the enemy present quite easily as far as Japan is concerned, readily I would say at hand as far as Japan is concerned, is of course China, a country that is very weak in the 19th and the 20th century. And that weakness is while exploited by several other European nations and of course the United States. But in addition to all of these other countries, it's perhaps the neighbor Japan that is most aggressive about this particular country of China. And as we have already seen, this kind of aggression as far as Japan is concerned is not only towards China, but there seems to be a military push in the country thinking of expansion and thinking of expansion as a military right. So China seems to be the very obvious country that seems to be on the receiving end of this militaristic expansion. So a quick look then at China, but only as far as it is linked to Japan and its expansion. The demise of the Qing dynasty, Qing with a Q, the last of the China's empires, began on 10th of October 1911 in what became known as the Double 10th Rebellion. This was followed by a long period of weak government known as warlordism, where regional leaders, largely self-appointed, within their own private militias, controlled whole provinces with scant regard with the nominal government in Beijing. So while Beijing remained the capital even after 1911, it is with the fall of the Qing emperors that Beijing merely retained a sort of a nominal position, while all the provincial governments, they became very, very powerful, and all these lords of these regional provinces, they declared themselves to be the true owners and inheritors. They did have some sort of a lip service to the emperor in Beijing, but they largely ruled on their own in terms of the large provinces. You can think about the breakup of any empire in the history of the world, and you'll have a very similar story. Once a big empire breaks, provinces and provincial rulers do seem to have a field day, be it the Roman Empire, be it the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or be it even the Mughal Empire as far as India is concerned. They break up, and then there is a huge rise of regional lords. As mentioned earlier, Japan entered World War I mainly to take over the German interests in China, an aim it achieved and attempted to build on with the 21 demands. We have already covered all of this in the previous videos. You may have a look at them. It presented to the Chinese central government. Had it not been for the protection of the United States, motivated again by a both long established link to China as well as concern over Japanese expansionism, it is likely that all 21 demands would have been conceded, which means that Japan would have managed to have that kind of an absolute control, at least administrative control of China. But because the US intervened, and mind you, US did not intervene for its own altruistic purposes. US intervenes because it wants its own cut in this entire scenario. So that is why US intervenes, and then of course that kind of a Japanese expansion into China meets with a certain kind of halt only for those years. So between 1911 and 1922, in those 10-11 odd years, let's see what is the relationship between China and Japan. Sino-Japanese rivalry, of course, you would remember, was actually over Korea. So Sino-Japanese rivalry over Korea has already been discussed in the first section of this chapter. We've already covered this in one of the previous videos. Relations between the countries did not improve as World War I came to an end. Negotiations over the Shandong province and whether it should remain with Japan or be returned to China, which had in fact entered the war on the side of the Allies and therefore was victorious in 1917, led to heated debates in Paris. Presenting the case of China was Wellington Koo, the Chinese ambassador to Washington. American educated with degrees from Columbia University, Koo was immensely educated and engaging and erudite. So very scholarly and very smart was the Chinese ambassador. Despite his eloquence, however, Koo's argument could not overcome the fact that it was pragmatic, at least in the short term, to give Shandong to Japan. Because Japan is such a powerful country, the League of Nations requires it, practically requires it as a key member during its own inception years. So despite the fact that everybody knew, and especially thanks to the kind of representative that China has, in this case Ambassador Koo, everybody knows that it's perhaps the right thing to give China Shandong, they still have to think about giving it to Japan because of the pragmatic reasons. Pragmatic, of course, for whom is the larger question that we should ask as historians, but that is the question that wasn't answered back then. This greatly incensed public opinion in China. Of course, they would not be very happy with the handing over of Shandong like this. And so much so that the supporters of the May 4th movement, the latter mainly comprising students from Peking University, who condemned the Western leaders for deserting China during what they claimed was a life and death struggle. So there is a lot of anger against Japan and against the League of Nations Western leaders who very clearly and seemingly are handing over everything to Japan in this case. Despairing over the lack of support from the West, many Chinese now turn to an alternative system adopted by the Soviet Union. So this is where the lure of communism starts to become attractive, because everything Western seems to have completely failed them, seems to have completely betrayed them. So as an alternative thought system, communism sounds very attractive to these revolting and to these rebelling Chinese students. Indeed, the Communist Party of China, set up in 1921, grew out of the May 4th movement. So there's a direct correlation between the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution in USSR. So that's the first key revolution. But very soon there's a rise of the Chinese Communist Party, and then the kind of principles that it adopts against the Western nations. Very soon it was clear that the resolution of the Shandong question was seen as a mixed blessing for Japan. It had aroused the hostility of many of its wartime allies. So many of the allies are also very clear that Japan did not deserve to have Shandong, and yet it got it. So Japan is actually on the receiving end of a lot of that flack. and underlining that this was a prize that was given grudgingly. It was not something that was given very happily. It was not something that was given very interestingly. According to Margaret Macmillan, somebody who we already met in one of the previous videos, an academic from the University of Oxford, in China, resentment affected Japanese business while Britain began to seriously rethink the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And we've already seen the kind of impact it has for Japan. Despite being an ally of Britain, it ends up cutting down its own navy to be in certain ratios of US, and of the UK. So in that sense, Japan has to suffer for all that it got out of the League of Nations. It may have got the Shandong province, but it was given begrudgingly, and it did have later impacts on Japan as well. Unsurprisingly, this concerned Japan greatly. Discussions were initiated by the Japanese in 1920 to return the Shandong to China. So if this is the kind of impact that getting Shandong has had on us, let us return it, some of the Japanese argued, so that we can get an equal treatment, so that we are accepted once again as this kind and loving country. Though China did not respond on this matter. The matter was eventually resolved during the Washington Conference. You already remember it, an important conference between UK and USA in 1921 and 22, when it was agreed that Shandong should in fact be given back to China, although with economic concessions to Japan. You have already seen this as a part of the discussion on the Washington Conference on an earlier video. So according to Han, at the Washington Conference, a settlement between Japan and China was reached. Japan agreed to return the German holdings in Shandong Peninsula to China, but it got China to agree to allow Japan to retain the railroad on the peninsula for 15 years. Sino-Japanese relations grew increasingly strained, however, as Japanese authorities intervened in Chinese political affairs during the 1920s, when a power struggle between the different warlord factions had taken place. So, it's a complete back and forth that's happening between China and Japan during this period. All of this then, let's see how China develops as far as its own nationality is concerned and how much of that is getting affected by Japan. So in China, you have the Kuomintang and the Northern Expedition. Despite some attempts at unity, China in the 1920s was riven with discord because it has gone through the entire decades of the 1910s and even in the 1920s bereft of any kind of central authority. So most of these provincial leaders, they have become extremely powerful, thereby leading to an era of warlordism. And in that, there is absolutely very weak and absolutely no sort of central power. And therefore, fighting amongst each other, discord, and all of that is the order of the day. Back in 1923, following the advice of the Comintern, which is the central communist group that USSR has created, members of the Communist Party of China had joined the Kuomintang or the Chinese Nationalist Party or the GMD to form a united front. So the Nationalist Party, which is the right wing, and the Chinese Communist Party, which is the left wing, they come together to form something called the United Front. So this is of course unheard of as far as politics is concerned. So this is like if you bring together the right wing and the left wing, there's nothing else left in politics. Alright, so yet they come together in the name of the betterment of China in that particular year of 1923. The year 1925 saw the death of Sun Yat-sen, founder and the head of the GMD. He was succeeded by Jiang Jiechi, the vehemently anti-communist head of the National Revolutionary Army. In 1926, Jiang launched the Northern Expedition to end the rule of the warlords, beginning in Guangdong province and heading north towards Shanghai, Beijing and Manchuria. So a nationalist leader who is the inheritor of the Nationalist Party, so basically the right-wing party, he takes on a northern expedition with the expressed aim of getting rid of warlords. So he starts from the southern part of China, goes up towards Beijing, towards Manchuria, towards Shanghai, with the aim of getting rid of warlords. One of Jiang's best known sayings was to be, the Japanese are a disease of the skin, but the communists are a disease of the heart. So while warlords are a very clear aim of the expulsion and of the complete extermination, it is the communists that are the true enemies that this nationalist leader wants to get rid of. The obvious question is how? Because just now we just read like 3 years ago, they had come together. But this is what happens when opposite powers become bedfellows in the name of politics. The fallout is also very quick and immediate And of course, as we can see in this case, quite bloody as well. In 1927, he demonstrated the depth of his hatred for the CPC, the Chinese Communist Party, by launching a campaign known as the White Terror to purge the GMD of communists. So if there were any communists who had become a part of the Nationalist Party under the previous leader, they were all purged, and this was called the White Terror. So again, the color white is often seen as the opposite of the color red, as was also seen in the case of the civil war in Russia after the Great War. The GMD advanced northwards. By 1928, they were moving towards the territory controlled by Zhang Zhaolin, and who, according to Jonathan Fenby, he's a historian, was China's biggest warlord. And known as the Old Marshal Zhang, he had actively cooperated with the Japanese, who had controlled the southern or South Manchurian railway. For the Japanese army in Manchuria, known as the Guangdong Army. Guangdong is pinyin for Kwantung, so that's a language kind of a shift. The northern expedition posed a threat to Japanese interests in Manchuria. Increasingly, the Japanese doubted the loyalty of Zhang Zhaolin, preferring to deal with his son Zhang Zioling, known unsurprisingly as the young marshal. So instead of the old marshal, who seemed to be a supporter, the Japanese preferred to go with the younger one, while all this time, by the way, maintaining a hatred for the Nationalist Party in China. A plot was hatched to dispose of the old marshal by first killing him and then waiting for his army to take the streets to seek revenge. The Guangdong army would then intervene to restore peace, and in doing so establish control over Manchuria. That's the plan that the Chinese Nationalist Party comes up with, by killing the warlord and blaming the Japanese for it. And in the bloodlust that will follow, they thought they will be able to capture and control Manchuria. The first part of the plot worked. A bomb was dropped on the old marshal's train carriage as he returned to Mukden in 1928. The critically injured warlord was taken to the hospital, where he died. Unexpectedly, however, and that's how usually history works, Zhang's army did not respond, thus presenting no opportunity for the Guangdong army to defend the Japanese interests. To make matters worse for the plotters, the young marshal came to an agreement with Jiang Zhesi, and in return was given autonomy over Manchuria. So the Japanese interests are fully and properly protected as well. Fenby notes that unlike his father, Zhang Zioling refused to cooperate with the Guangdong army and showed every intention of seeking further integration with China by building a railway to compete with the Japanese-run South Manchurian Railway. The Guangdong army did not try again to control until 1931. So there's this sort of a complete outmaneuvering of these two and several other groups as far as China is concerned. With this, let us just spend some time now trying to understand the couple of questions. Let's deal with them. I am doing this as a part of the activity so that we can see what kind of questions do usually come in the exam. So the countries that attended and signed the Washington, this is activity 12 as a part of this text. So the countries that attended and signed the Washington Treaty also agreed on the 9-part treaty signed in February 1922, which guaranteed the sovereignty of China and an open door trading policy. We have already read about this in a previous section. So Article 1 of that particular treaty says that the contracting powers other than China, they agree to respect the sovereignty, the independence and the territorial and administrative integrity of China, to provide the fullest and most unembarrassed opportunity to China to develop and maintain for herself an effective and stable government, so no intervention from any other country, to use their influence for the purpose of effectually establishing and maintaining the principle of equal opportunity for the commerce and industry of all nations throughout the territory of China, and finally to refrain from taking advantage of conditions of China in order to seek special rights or privileges which would abridge the rights of subjects or citizens of friendly states, and from countenancing action inimical to the security of such states. So complete protection of China against this kind of states who are trying to take advantage of China. So your question is, with reference to its origin, purpose and content, analyze the value and limitation of this source to historians studying the post-war settlements. Now, how do you think about this kind of a contract and this kind of an article when you're thinking about the post-war settlements? So the obvious answer is that in this case, the limitation will have to deal with the information that is being presented versus the reality which is not. That is a major limitation. That is a very clear limitation, that the source only presents to us one aspect of a political document that is being presented to the world. It in no way shows us what is the actual reality on ground between these countries. So for example, the idea here that there will be no interest in taking the advantage of the conditions of China. But every other country is very much interested in doing that, even the countries which are signing this kind of a contract. So this is a major limitation. What is the value? As a primary source, its greatest value is that it captures the moment during which this discussion is taking place. It captures the true sentiment, at least the political sentiment, of various of these major superpowers which are ending up and which are coming together to sign this document. Now, what have I done? I have taken the question's key aspect, which is post-war settlement, and then I have tried to give value and limitation, thinking of the politics of the time. Had the same question asked me to think about and reflect about the social conditions, my answer would have perhaps been a bit different. So it's very important to keep in mind what is it, or on the basis of what is the question asking you to think about the value and limitations. Let's look at another source. Now that you have read through this chapter, answer the following questions. This is very similar to the kind of mini essay that you would get in the exam. But it's also very important, the chapter says it, and even we would suggest this here at Nail IB, the fact that the last question should not be attempted first. Even though it seems very obvious that you might want to jump to the last question because it has the highest tariff, the idea is that the sources are arranged in such a way that your knowledge base is built, your own ideas are built as you cross through certain questions. If you directly jump to the last question, there is no way that you will be able to use the analysis that you've done in the previous three questions, which would in fact benefit you very hugely for that last question. So it's best not to attempt that last question in the first go. Probably one more activity. This is activity 11, taken from the book Paris 1919. This is again by Margaret Macmillan. Below is a description of Wellington coup by Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister. So the French Prime Minister was also a part of this negotiation at the Paris Peace Conference. He says, he is a young Chinese cat, partisan of speech and dress, absorbed in the pleasure of patting and pawing the mouse, even if it was reserved for the Japanese. So even when the mouse is reserved for another country, like a Chinese cat, he ends up, being absolutely interested in pawing that mouse. According to the quotation, that's the question. That's your question. According to the question above, what is the mouse meant to symbolize? So very clearly, Shandong province is the mouse in this kind of a quotation, because that is something that both Ku also wants, who is the Chinese ambassador, and that is something which, according to Clemenceau, should have gone to the Japanese, or in fact was reserved for the Japanese. So if you remember, for the practical purposes of the League of Nations, Shandong was supposed to be given to Japan. What impression does the source give of Wellington coup? It gives the source the fact that you are being compared to a Chinese cat very clearly shows that you are being praised or not praised, but you are definitely being observed for your ability to be very, very clever and cunning. Alright, so he is being, the impression that this source conveys of Wellington coup is that of a person who is very clever and who's also enjoys a certain kind of patting. So somebody who gets very close to people in power, enjoys their endorsement, but also is completely and very clearly on one side as far as a certain style of dressing is concerned. Pardon me, I misread the word partisan. In fact, the key word here is Parisian. So Parisian of speech and dress. So he's very stylish. He's somebody who's extremely, has a certain kind of attitude, has a certain kind of dapper attitude. So again, that is the kind of perception that is being conveyed, that he's a very stylish person who has a certain kind of French attitude in terms of engagement, but also very clear about what belongs to him and his country, which in this case is of course Shandong. So these two are very good sources, and as a quick activity, we'll try to continue doing this in other chapters as well, so that you can continue to get some interest out of this entire exercise. I'm just focusing in for a second on Wellington coup and his wife as they were photographed in 1920. So let us just very quickly then, in this last few seconds, let us quickly then review this entire chapter so far. This is the end of our first main important portion. So this chapter focused on Japanese rise as a modern nation state from the late 19th century to the 1920s. In particular, it has examined how the Meiji Restoration established an economic and military basis for Japanese expansion and its aspiration to be regarded as a world power. So rather than just being a local power in Asia, a world power, it has also looked at the relationship between Japan and its neighbors, including its response to the decline of Chinese Manchu Empire and growing rivalry with the Romanov Empire of Russia. The impact of World War I upon Japan and the opportunities it offered has been outlined, as has Japan's role in the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The chapter has ended with an overview of the political and social changes that Japan underwent during the 1920s, as well as an analysis of its growing tension with the nationalist China over the status of Manchuria. So let's very quickly then look at our syllabus so that we can predict what will be our next important key topic. We'll be next looking at the events and looking at greater detail all of these key events that are going to play a role as far as the rise and expansion of Japan is concerned. So I remain very super excited to look at more of these events and discussions, and I do hope that you will be able to join us in the next video. Till then, thank you so much.